Hello, alchemists. Welcome or welcome back. My name is Ava, aka Queen Midas Life Alchemist, and I am here for another episode of Weekend Book Club. We are on week 16, so if you are new, welcome. However, I would highly suggest that you start from week 1 because we are reading through this book here of The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body, and the Healing of Trauma by Bessel Van Der Kolk, MD. And as I said, we're on week 16, so we have already moved through the book and we're almost done. So go back and start from week 1. It's truly worth it. There's so much great information on healing and how the body holds trauma and fear and how that manifests physically in our relationships and in our bodies as well, and in our patterns. What else? Yeah, so you will find all of my links in the description box below. There's also a link for this book if you want to purchase your own copy. Within my link tree link, you'll find my Calendly booking link for private tarot and oracle readings. You will also find my Patreon link along with my social medias and other affiliate brands that I am connected with. So I'd love to have you on our Telegram chat. We just kind of share information and encourage each other. It's really fun over there. And then also my Patreon, I offer weekly readings specific for my patron community. I have a monthly newsletter, discounts on personal readings, discounts in my partners' shops, which are Liz's shop, Olivera by Elizabeth, and then also Soulstone Organites, which is my dear friend Dory's Etsy shop. Also, what am I missing? We have bi-weekly private chats for the patron community only, and the top level. So the top level is going to be my coaching tier called the Midas Touch, where you get one-on-one Zoom time with me. We go over where you're at in your spiritual journey, set some affirmations, set some goals to work through for that month. And then at the end of the month, we do a recap and see where you're at and where we need to shift for the following month. There is also you also get a monthly oracle read on all of the tiers. And yeah, so it's just a lot of extra content. Oh, early access to YouTube content as well. So yeah, that is my spiel. So let's go ahead and get started. We're picking up on page 285 called A Life. Oh, just kidding. Picking up on page 286 called Meeting the Managers. As Joan's treatment progressed, we identified many different parts that were in charge at different times. An aggressive childlike part that threw tantrums, a promiscuous adolescent part, a suicidal part, an obsessive manager, a prissy moralist, and so on. As usual, we met the managers first. Their job was to prevent humiliation and abandonment and to keep her organized and safe. Many managers may be aggressive, like Joan's critic, while others are perfectionistic or reserved, careful not to draw too much attention to themselves. They may tell us to turn a blind eye to what is going on and keep us passive to avoid risk. Internal managers also control how much access we have to emotions so that the self system doesn't get overwhelmed. It requires an enormous amount of energy to keep the system under control. A single flirtatious comment may trigger several parts simultaneously. One that becomes intensely sexually aroused, another filled with self-loathing, a third that tries to calm things down by self-cutting. Other managers create obsessions and distractions or deny reality altogether. But each part should be approached as an internal protector who maintains an important defensive position. Managers carry huge burdens of responsibility and usually are in over their heads. Some managers are extremely competent. Many of my patients hold responsible positions, do outstanding professional jobs, and can be superbly attentive parents. Joan's critical manager undoubtedly contributed to her success as an ophthalmologist. I have had numerous patients who were highly skilled teachers or nurses. While their colleagues may have experienced them as a bit distant or reserved, they would probably have been astonished to discover that their exemplary coworkers engage in self-mutilation, eating disorders, or bizarre sexual practices. Gradually, Joan started to realize that it is normal to simultaneously experience conflicting feelings or thoughts, which gave her more confidence to face the task ahead. Instead of believing that hate consumed her entire being, she learned that only a part of her felt paralyzed by it. However, after a negative evaluation at work, Joan went into a tailspin, berating herself for not protecting herself, then feeling clingy, weak, and powerless. When I asked her to see where that powerless part was located in her body and how she felt toward it, she resisted. She told me she couldn't understand that whiny, incompetent girl who made her feel embarrassed and contemptuous about herself. I suspected that this part held much of the memory of her abuse, and I decided not to pressure her at this point. She left my office withdrawn and upset. The next day, she raided the refrigerator and then spent hours vomiting up her food. When she returned to my office, she told me that she wanted to kill herself and was surprised that I seemed genuinely curious and non-judgmental, and that I did not condemn her for either her bulimia or her suicidality. When I asked her what parts were involved, the critic came back and blurted out, "She is disgusting." When she asked that part to step back, the next part said, "Nobody will ever love me," followed again by the critic, who told me that the best way to help her would be to ignore all that noise and increase her medications. Clearly, in their desire to protect her injured parts, these managers were unintentionally doing her harm. So I kept asking them what they thought would happen if they stepped back. Joan answered, "People will hate me, and I will be all alone out on the street." This was followed by her memory. Her mother had told her that if she disobeyed, she would be put up for adoption and never see her sisters or dog again. When I asked her how she felt about that scared little girl inside, she cried and said that she felt bad for her. Now herself was back, and I was confident that we had calmed the system down, but this session turned out to be too much too soon. Next section is called Putting Out the Flames on page 288. The following week, Joan missed her appointment. We had triggered her exiles, and her firefighters went on a rampage. As she told me later, the evening after we talked about her terror of being put into foster care, she felt as if she were going to blast out of herself. She went to a bar and picked up a guy. Coming home late, drunk, and disheveled, she refused to talk to her husband and fell asleep in the den. The next morning, she acted as if nothing had happened. Firefighters will do anything to make emotional pain go away. Aside from sharing the task of keeping the exiles locked up, they are the opposite of managers. Managers are all about staying in control, while firefighters will destroy the house in order to extinguish the fire. The struggle between uptight managers and out-of-control firefighters will continue until the exiles, which carry the burden of the trauma, are allowed to come home and be cared for. Anyone who deals with survivors will encounter those firefighters. I've met firefighters who shop, drink, play computer games addictively, have impulsive affairs, or exercise compulsively. A sordid encounter can blunt the abused child's horror and shame, if only for a couple of hours. It is critical to remember that at their core, firefighters are also desperately trying to protect the system. Unlike managers who are unusually superficially cooperative during therapy, firefighters don't hold back. They hurl insights and storm out of the room. Firefighters are frantic, and if you ask them what would happen if they stopped doing their job, you discover that they believe that the exiled feelings would crash the entire self-system. They are also oblivious to the idea that there are better ways to guarantee physical and emotional safety. And even if behaviors like binging or cutting stop, firefighters often find other methods of self-harm. These cycles will come to an end only when the self is able to take charge and the system feels safe. Next section, page 289, called The Burden of Toxicity. Exiles are the toxic waste dump of the system. Because they hold the memories, sensations, beliefs, and emotions associated with trauma, it is hazardous to release them. They contain the "oh my God" I'm done for experience, the essence of inescapable shock, and with it, terror, collapse, and accommodation. Exiles may reveal themselves in the form of crushing physical sensations or extreme numbing, and they offend both the reasonableness of the managers and the bravado of the firefighters. Like most incest survivors, Joan hated her exiles, particularly the little girl who had responded to her abuser's sexual demands and the terrified child who whimpered alone in her bed. When exiles overwhelm managers, they take us over. We are nothing but that rejected, weak, unloved, and abandoned child. The self becomes blended with the exiles, and every possible alternative for their life is eclipsed. Then, as Schwartz points out, we see ourselves in the world through their eyes and believe it is the world. It is the world, excuse me. In this state, it won't occur to us that we have been hijacked. Keeping the exiles locked up, however, stamps out not only memories and emotions, but also the parts that hold them, the parts that were hurt and caught the most by the trauma. In Schwartz's words, usually those are the most sensitive, creative, intimacy-loving, lively, playful, and innocent parts. By exiling them when they get hurt, they suffer a double whammy. The insult of your rejection is added to their original injury. As Joan discovered, keeping the exiles hidden and despised was condemning her to a life without intimacy or genuine joy. So we are on the next section called Unlocking the Past. This is on page 289, and here we go. Several months into Joan's treatment, we again assess the exiled girl who carried the humiliation, confusion, and shame of Jane's molestation. By then, she had come to trust me enough and had developed enough sense of self to be able to tolerate observing herself as a child, with her long-buried feelings of horror, excitement, surrender, and complicity. She did not say very much during this process, and my main job was to keep her in a state of calm self-observation. She often had the impulse to pull away in disgust and horror, leaving this unacceptable child alone in her misery. At these points, I asked her protectors to step back so that she could keep listening to what the little girl wanted her to know. Finally, with my encouragement, she was able to rush into the scene and take the girl away with her to a safe place. She firmly told her abuser that she would never let him get close to her again. Instead of denying the child, she played the active role in liberating her. As an EMDR, the resolution of trauma was the result of her ability to access her imagination and rework the scenes in which she had become frozen so long ago. Helpless passivity was replaced by determined self-led action. Once Joan started to own her impulses and behaviors, she recognized the emptiness of her relationship with her husband, Brian, and began to insist on change. I invited her to ask Brian to meet us, and she was present for 8 sessions before he began to see me individually. Schwartz observes that IFS can help family members mentor each other as they learn to observe how one person's parts interact with another's. I witnessed this firsthand with Joan and Brian. Brian was initially quite proud of having put up with Joan's behavior for so long. Feeling that she really needed him had kept him from even considering divorce. But now that she wanted more intimacy, he felt pressured and inadequate, revealing a panicked part that blanked out and put up a wall against feeling. Gradually, Brian began to talk about growing up in an alcoholic family where behaviors like Joan's were common and largely ignored, punctuated by his father's stays in detox centers and his mother's long hospitalizations for depression and suicide attempts. When I asked his panic part what would happen if it allowed Brian to feel anything, he revealed his fear of being overwhelmed by pain. The pain of his childhood added to the pain of his relationship with Joan. Over the next few weeks, other parts emerged. First came a protector that was frightened of women and determined never to let Brian become more vulnerable to their manipulations. Then we discovered a strong caretaker part that had looked after his mother and his younger siblings. This part gave Brian a feeling of self-worth and purpose and a way of dealing with his own terror. Finally, Brian was ready to meet his exile, the scared, essentially motherless child who'd had no one to care for him. This was a very short version of a long exploration, which involved many diversions, as when Joan's critic reemerged from time to time. But from the beginning, IFS helped Joan and Brian hear themselves and each other from the perspective of an objective, curious, and compassionate self. They were no longer locked in the past, and a whole range of new possibilities opened up for them. That's so awesome. Okay, we are on a new section, page 291, the power of self-compassion in IFS and the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. Nancy Shattuck is a rheumatologist in Boston's Brigham and Women's Hospital who combines medical research on rheumatoid arthritis with a strong interest in her patients' personal experience of their illness. When she discovered IFS at a workshop with Richard Schwartz, she noticed and she decided to incorporate the therapy into a study of psychosocial intervention with RA patients. RA, or rheumatoid arthritis, is an autoimmune disease that causes inflammatory disorders throughout the body, causing chronic pain and disability. Medication can delay its process and relieve some of the pain, but there is no cure, and living with RA can lead to depression, anxiety, isolation, and overall impaired quality of life. I followed this study with particular interest because the link I observed between trauma and autoimmune disease. Working with senior IFS therapist Nancy Sowell, Dr. Shattuck created a 9-month randomized study in which one group of RA patients would receive both group and individual instruction in IFS, while a control group received regular mailings and phone calls regarding disease symptoms and management. Both groups continued with their regular medications, and they were assessed periodically by rheumatologists who were not informed which group they belonged to. The goal of the IFS group was to teach patients how to adapt and understand their inevitable fear, hopelessness, and anger, and to treat those feelings as members of their own internal family. They would learn the inner dialogue skills that would enable them to recognize their pain, identify the accompanying thoughts and emotions, and then approach these internal states with interest and compassion. A basic problem emerged early. Like so many trauma survivors, the RA patients were alexithemic. As Nancy Sowell later told me, they never complained about their pain or disability unless they were totally overwhelmed. And asked how they were feeling, they almost always replied, "I'm fine." Their stoic parts clearly helped them cope, but these managers also kept them in a state of denial. Some shut out their bodily sensations and emotions to the extent that they could not collaborate effectively with their doctors. To get things moving, the leaders introduced the IFS parts dramatically, rearranging furniture and props to represent managers, exiles, and firefighters. Over the course of several weeks, group members began to talk about the managers who told them to grin and bear it, because no one wanted to hear about the pain anyway. Then, as they asked the stoic parts to step back, they started to acknowledge the angry parts that wanted to yell and wreak havoc, the part that wanted to stay in bed all the time, and the exile who felt worthless because she wasn't allowed to talk. It emerged that, as children, nearly all of them were supposed to be seen and not heard. Safety meant keeping their needs under wraps. Individual IFS therapy helped patients apply the language of parts to daily issues. For example, one woman felt trapped by conflicts at her job, where a manager part insisted the only way out was to overwork until her RA flared up. With the therapist's help, she realized that she could care for her needs without making herself sick. The two groups, IFS and controls, were evaluated 3 times during the 9-month study period, and then again 1 year later. At the end of 9 months, the IFS group showed measurable improvements in self-assessed joint pain, physical function, self-compassion, and overall pain relative to the education group. They also showed significant improvements in depression and self-efficacy. The IFS group's gains in pain perception and depression symptoms were sustained 1 year later, although objective medical tests could no longer detect measurable improvements in pain or function. In other words, what had changed most was the patient's ability to live with their disease. In their conclusions, Shattuck and Sowell emphasize IFS's focus on self-compassion as a key factor. This was not the first study to show that psychological interventions can help RA patients. Cognitive behavioral therapies and mindfulness-based practices have also been shown to have a positive impact on pain, joint inflammation, physical disability, and depression. However, none of these studies has asked a crucial question. Are increased psychological safety and comfort reflected in a better functioning immune system? And we are moving on to the next section. This is page 292, called Liberating the Exiled Child. If you are enjoying this, please remember to like the video, please, and share any comments that you might have as well. Thank you. Okay, Liberating the Exiled Child. Peter ran an oncology service at a prestigious academic medical center that was consistently rated as one of the best in the country. As he sat in my office in perfect physical shape because of his regular squash practice, his confidence had crossed the line into arrogance. This man certainly did not seem to suffer from PTSD. He told me he just wanted to know how he could help his wife to be less touchy. She had threatened to leave him unless he did something about what she termed his callous behavior. Peter assured me that her perception was warped because he obviously had no problem being empathetic with sick people. He loved talking about his work, proud of the fact that the residents and fellows competed fiercely to be on his service, and also of scuttlebutt he'd heard about his staff being terrified of him. He described himself as brutally honest, a real scientist, someone who just looked at the facts and with a meaningful glance in my direction did not suffer fools gladly. He had high standards, but no higher than he had for himself. And he assured me that he didn't need anybody's love, just their respect. Peter had also told me that his psychiatry rotation in med school had convinced him that psychiatrists still practice witchcraft, and his one stint in couples therapy had further confirmed that opinion. He expressed contempt for people who blamed their parents and society for their problems. Even though he had had his own share of misery as a child, he was determined never to think of himself as a victim. While Peter's toughness and his love for precision appealed to me, I could not help but wonder if he would discover something I'd seen all too often, that internal managers who are obsessed with power are usually created as a bulwark against feeling helpless. When I asked him about his family, Peter told me that his father ran a manufacturing business. He was a Holocaust survivor who could be brutal and exacting. But he also had a tender and sentimental side that had kept Peter connected with him and that had inspired Peter to become a physician. As he told me about his mother, he realized for the first time that she had substituted rigorous housekeeping for genuine care, but Peter denied that this bothered him. He went to a school and got straight A's. He had vowed to build a life free of rejection and humiliation, but ironically, he lived with death and rejection every day. Death on the oncology ward and the constant struggle to get his research funded and published. Peter's wife joined us for the next meeting. She described how he criticized her incessantly, her taste in clothes, her child rearing practices, her reading habits, her intelligence, her friends. He was rarely at home and never emotionally available. Because he had so many important obligations and because he was so explosive, his family always tiptoed around him. She was determined to leave him and start a new life unless he made some radical changes. At that point, for the first time, I saw Peter become obviously distressed. He assured me and his wife that he wanted to work things out. At our next session, I asked him to let his body relax, close his eyes, focus his attention inside, and ask that critical part, the one his wife had identified, what it was afraid would happen if he stopped the ruthless judging. After about 30 seconds, he said it felt stupid talking to himself. He didn't want to try some new age gimmick. He'd come to me looking for empirically verified therapy. I assured him that, like him, I was at the forefront of empirically based therapies and that this was one of them. He was silent for perhaps a minute before he whispered, "I would get hurt." I urged him to ask the critic what it meant. Still, with his eyes closed, Peter replied, "If you criticize others, they don't dare hurt you. Then, if you are perfect, nobody can criticize you." I asked him to thank his critic for protecting him against hurt and humiliation. And as he became silent again, I could see his shoulders relax and his breathing become slower and deeper. He next told me that he was aware that this pomposity was affecting his relationships with his colleagues and students. He felt lonely and despised during staff meetings and uncomfortable at hospital parties. When I asked him if he wanted to change the way that angry part threatened people, he replied that he did. I then asked him where it was located in his body, and he found it in the middle of his chest. Keeping that focus inside, I asked him how he felt toward it. He said it made him scared. Next, I asked him to stay focused on it and see how he felt toward it now. He said he was curious to know more about it. I asked him how old it was. He said about 7. I asked him to have his critics show him what he protected. After a lengthy silence, still with his eyes closed, he told me that he was witnessing a scene from his childhood. His father was beating a little boy, him, and he was standing at one side, thinking how stupid that kid was to provoke his dad. When I asked him how he felt about the boy who was getting hurt, he told me that he despised him. He was a weakling and a whiner. After showing even the least bit of defiance to his dad's high-handed ways, he inevitably capitulated and whimpered that he would be a good little boy. He had no guts, no fire in his belly. I asked the critic if he would be willing to step aside so we could see what was going on with that boy. In response, the critic appeared in full force and called him names like wimp and sissy. I asked Peter again if the critic would be willing to step aside and give the boy a chance to speak. He shut down completely and left the session saying that he was unlikely to ever set foot in my office again. But the following week, he was back. As she had threatened, his wife had gone to a lawyer and filed for divorce. He was devastated and no longer looked anything like the perfectly put together doctor whom I'd come to know and in many ways dread. Faced with the loss of his family, he became unhinged and felt comforted by the idea that if things got too bad, he could take his life in his own hands. We went inside and identified the part that was terrified of abandonment. Once he was in his mindful self state, I urged him to ask that terrified boy to show him the burdens he was carrying. Again, his first reaction was disgust at the boy's weakness, but after I asked him to get that part to step back, he saw an image of himself as a young boy in his parents' house, alone in his room, screaming in terror. Peter watched the scene for several minutes, weeping silently through much of it. I asked him if the boy had told him everything he wanted to know. No, there were other scenes, like running to embrace his father at the door and getting slapped for having disobeyed his mother. From time to time, he would interrupt the process by explaining why his parents couldn't have done any better than they had, there being Holocaust survivors and all that implied. Again, I suggested he find the protective parts that were interrupting the witnessing of the boy's pain and request that they move temporarily to another room. And each time he was able to return to his grief. I asked Peter to tell the boy that he now understood how bad the experience had been. He sat in a long, sad silence. Then I asked him to show the boy that he cared about him. After some coaxing, he put his arms around the boy. I was surprised that this seemingly harsh and callous man knew exactly how to take care of him. Then, after some time, I urged Peter to go back to the scene and take the boy away with him. Peter imagined himself confronting his dad as a grown man, telling him, "If you ever mess with that boy again, I'll come and kill you." He then, in his imagination, took the child to a beautiful campground he knew, where the boy could play and frolic with ponies while he watched over him. Our work was not done. After his wife rescinded their threat of divorce, some of his old habits returned, and we had to revisit the isolated boy from time to time to make sure that Peter's wounded parts were taken care of, especially when he felt hurt by something that happened at home or on his job. This is the stage IFS calls unburdening, and it corresponds to nursing those exiled parts back to health. With each new unburdening, Peter's once unscathed inner critic relaxed. Once scathing inner critic relaxed. As little by little, it became more like a mentor than a judge, and he began to repair his relationships with his family and colleagues. He also stopped suffering from tension headaches. One day, he told me that he'd spent his adulthood trying to let go of his past, and he remarked how ironic it was that he had to get closer to it in order to let it go. All right, we are on to a new chapter, chapter 18, called Filling the Holes, Creating the Structures. And this starts off with a couple quotes. First one from William James. "The greatest discovery of my generation is that human beings can alter their lives by altering their attitudes of mind." Then Carl Jung. "It is not that something different is seen, but that one sees differently. It is as though the spatial act of seeing were changed by a new dimension." All right, let's start this chapter. "It is one thing to process memories of trauma, but it is an entirely different matter to confront the inner void, the holes in the soul that result from not having been wanted, not having been seen, and not having been allowed to speak the truth. If your parents' faces never lit up when they looked at you, it's hard to know what it feels like to be loved and cherished. If you come from an incomprehensible world filled with secrecy and fear, it's almost impossible to find the words to express what you have endured. If you grew up unwanted and ignored, it is a major challenge to develop a visceral sense of agency and self-worth." Wow. I can attest to that. Okay, anyway, the research that Judy Herman, Chris Perry, and I had done, see chapter 9, showed that people who felt unwanted as children and those who did not remember feeling safe with anyone while growing up did not fully benefit from conventional psychotherapy, presumably because they could not activate old traces of feeling cared for. I could see this even in some of my most committed and articulate patients. Despite their hard work in therapy and their sense of personal and professional accomplishments, they could not erase the devastating imprints of a mother who was too depressed to notice them or a father who treated them like he wished they'd never been born. It was clear that their lives would change fundamentally if only they could reconstruct those implicit maps. But how? How can we help people become more viscerally acquainted with their feelings that were lacking, in their early lives? I glimpsed a possible answer when I attended the founding conference of the United States Association for Body Psychotherapy in June 1994 at a small college in Beverly on the rocky Massachusetts coast. Ironically, I had been asked to represent mainstream psychiatry at the meeting and to speak on using brain scans to visualize mental states. But as soon as I walked into the lobby where attendees were gathered for morning coffee, I realized that this was a different crowd from my usual psychopharmacology or psychotherapy gatherings. The way they talked to one another, their postures and gestures radiated vitality and engagement, the sort of physical reciprocity that is the essence of attunement. I soon struck up a conversation with Albert Pesso, a stocky former dancer with the Martha Graham Dance Company, who was then in his early 70s. Underneath his bushy eyebrows, he exuded kindness and confidence. He told me that he had found a way of fundamentally changing people's relationship to their core somatic selves. His enthusiasm was infectious, but I was skeptical and asked him if he was certain he could change the settings of the amygdala. Unfazed by the fact that nobody had ever tested this method scientifically, he confidently assured me that he could. Pesso was about to conduct a workshop in PBSP, psychomotor therapy, and he invited me to attend. It was unlike any group work I had ever seen. He took a low chair opposite a woman named Nancy, whom he called a protagonist, with the other patients seated on pillows around him. He then invited Nancy to talk about what was troubling her, occasionally asking her, using her pauses to witness what he was observing, as in, a witness can see how crestfallen you are when you talk about your father deserting the family. I was impressed by how carefully he tracked subtle shifts in body posture, facial expression, tone of voice, and eye gaze, the nonverbal expressions of emotion. This was called micro-tracking in psychomotor therapy. Each time Pesso made a witness statement, Nancy's face and body relaxed a bit, as if she felt comforted by being seen and validated. His quiet comments seemed to bolster her courage to continue and go deeper. When Nancy started to cry, he observed that nobody should have to bear so much pain all by herself. And he asked that if she would like to choose someone to sit next to her. He called this a contact person. Nancy nodded, and after carefully scanning the room, pointed to a kind-looking middle-aged woman. Pesso asked Nancy where she would like her contact person to sit. Right here, Nancy said, decisively indicating a pillow immediately to her right. I was fascinated. People process spatial relations with the right hemisphere of the brain, and our neuroimaging research had shown that the imprint of trauma is principally on the right hemisphere as well. See Chapter 3. Caring, disapproval, and indifference are all primarily conveyed by facial expression, tone of voice, and physical movements. According to research, up to 90% of human communication occurs in the nonverbal right hemisphere realm. And this is where Pesso's work seemed primarily to be directed. As the workshop went on, I was also struck by how the contact person's presence seemed to help Nancy tolerate the painful experience she was dredging up. But what was most unusual was how Pesso created tableaus, or as he called them, structures of the protagonist's past. As the narratives unfolded, group participants were asked to play the roles of significant people in the protagonist's lives, such as parents and other family members, so that the inner world began to take form in three-dimensional space. Group members were also enlisted to play the ideal wished-for parents who would provide the support, love, and protection that had been lacking at critical moments. Protagonists became the directors of their own plays, creating around them the past they never had, and they clearly experienced profound physical and mental relief after these imaginary scenarios. Could this technique instill imprints of safety and comfort alongside those of terror and abandonment decades after the original shaping of the mind and brain? Intrigued with the promise of Pesso's work, I eagerly accepted his invitation to visit his hilltop farmhouse in southern New Hampshire. After lunch beneath an ancient oak tree, Al asked me to join him in his red clapboard barn, now a studio, to do a structure. I'd spent several years in psychoanalysis, so I did not expect any major revelations. I was a settled professional man in my 40s with my own family, and I thought of my parents as two elderly people who were trying to create a decent old age for themselves. I certainly did not think they still had a major influence on me. Since there were no other people available for role play, Al began by asking me to select an object or a piece of furniture to represent my father. I chose a gigantic black chair and asked Al to put it upright about 8 feet in front of me, slightly to the left. Then he asked if I'd like to bring my mother into the room as well, and I chose a heavy lamp, approximately the same height as the upright couch. As the session continued, the space became populated with the important people in my life. My best friend, a tiny Kleenex box to my right, my wife, a small pillow next to him, my 2 children, 2 more tiny pillows. After a while, I surveyed the projection of my internal landscape, 2 hulking, dark, and threatening objects representing my parents, and an array of minuscule objects representing my wife, children, and friends. I was astounded. I had recreated my inner image of my stern Calvinistic parents from the time I was a little boy. My chest felt tight, and I'm sure that my voice sounded even tighter. I could not deny what my spatial brain was revealing, the structure that allowed me to visualize my implicit map of my world. When I told Al that what I had uncovered, he nodded and asked if I would allow him to change my perspective. I felt my skepticism return, but I liked Al and was curious about his method, so I hesitantly agreed. He then interposed his body directly between me and the couch and lamp, making them disappear from my line of sight. Instantaneously, I felt a deep release in my body. The constriction in my chest eased and breathing became relaxed. That was the moment I decided to become Pesso's student. That's cool. I love how open Bessel is to new techniques and just learning. Even though he's got this science background, he's still open to like more alternative therapies, which is cool. And being open and willing to be a student leaves space to receive more knowledge and excuse me, development and growth. So that's really cool. Excuse me. We are onto a new section called Restructuring Inner Maps, and this is on page 299. Projecting your inner world into the three-dimensional space of a structure enables you to see what's happening in the theater of the mind and gives you a much clearer perspective on your reactions to people and events in the past. As you position placeholders for the important people in your life, you may be surprised by the unexpected memories, thoughts, and emotions that come up. You then can experiment with moving the pieces around on the external chessboard that you've created and see what effect it has on you. Although the structures involve dialogue, psychomotor therapy does not explain or interpret the past. Instead, it allows you to feel what you felt back then, to visualize what you saw, and to say what you could not say when it actually happened. It's as if you could go back into the movie of your life and rewrite the crucial scenes. You can direct the role players to do things they failed to do in the past, such as keeping your father from beating up your mom. These tableaus can stimulate powerful emotions. For example, as you place your real mother in the corner, cowering in terror, you may feel a deep longing to protect her and realize how powerless you felt as a child. But if you then create an ideal mother who stands up to your father and who knows how to avoid getting trapped in abusive relationships, you may experience a visceral sense of relief and an unburdening that old guilt and an unburdening of that old guilt and helplessness. Or you might confront the brother who brutalized you as a child and then create an ideal brother who protects you and becomes your role model. The job of the director, psychotherapist, and other group members is to provide protagonists with the support they need to delve into whatever they have been too afraid to explore on their own. The safety of the group allows you to notice things that you have hidden from yourself, usually the things you are most ashamed of. When you no longer have to hide, the structure allows you to place the shame where it belongs, on the figures right in front of you who represent those who hurt you and made you feel helpless as a child. Feeling safe means you can say things to your father, or rather the placeholder who represents him, that you wish you could have said as a 5-year-old. You can tell the placeholder for your depressed and frightened mother how horrible you felt about not being able to take care of her. You can experiment with distance and proximity and explore what happens as you move placeholders around. As an active participant, you can lose yourself in a scene in a way you cannot when you simply tell a story. And as you take charge of representing the reality of your experience, the witness keeps you company, reflecting the changes in your posture, facial expression, and tone of voice. In my experience, physically re-experiencing the past in the present and then reworking it in a safe, supportive container can be powerful enough to create new supplemental memories, simulated experiences of growing up in an attuned, affectionate setting where you were protected from harm. EMDR structures do not erase bad memories or even neutralize them the way that EMDR does. Instead, a structure offers fresh options, an alternative memory in which your basic human needs are met and your longings for love and protection are fulfilled. So cool. New section on page 300. This is actually our last section. We have a couple more page turns for today. Page 300 called Revising the Past. Let me give you an example from a workshop I led not long ago at the Salon Institute in Big Sur, California. Maria was a slender, athletic Filipina in her 40s who had been pleasant and accommodating during our first 2 days, which had been devoted to exploring the long-term impact of trauma and teaching self-regulation techniques. But now, seated on her pillow about 6 feet away from me, she looked scared and collapsed. I wondered to myself if she had volunteered as a protagonist mainly to please the girlfriend who had accompanied her to the workshop. I began by encouraging her to notice what was going on inside her and to share whatever came to mind. After a long silence, she said, "I can't really feel anything in my body and my mind is blank." Mirroring her inner tension, I replied, "A witness can see how worried you are that your mind is blank and you don't feel anything after volunteering to do a structure. Is that right?" "Yes," she answered, sounding slightly relieved. The witness figure enters the structure at the very beginning and takes the role of an accepting, non-judgmental observer who joins the protagonist by reflecting his or her emotional state and noting the context in which that state has emerged. As when I mentioned Maria's volunteering to do a structure. Being validated by feeling heard and seen is a precondition for feeling safe, which is critical when we explore the dangerous territory of trauma and abandonment. A neuroimaging study has shown that when people hear a statement that mirrors their inner state, the right amygdala momentarily lights up, as if to underline the accuracy of the reflection. I encouraged Maria to keep focusing on her breath, one of the exercises we had been practicing together, and to notice what she was feeling in her body. After another long silence, she hesitantly began to speak. "There is always a sense of fear in everything I do. It doesn't look like I'm afraid, but I am always pushing myself. It is really difficult for me to be up here," I reflected. As witness, we can a witness can see how uncomfortable you feel pushing yourself to be here. And she nodded, slightly straightening her spine, signaling that she felt understood. She continued, "I grew up thinking that my family was normal, but I always was terrified by my dad. I never felt cared for by him. He never hit me as hard as he did my siblings, but I have a pervasive sense of fear." I noted that a witness could see how afraid she looked as she spoke of her father, and then I invited her to select a group member to represent him. Maria scanned the room and chose Scott, a gentle video producer who had been a lively and supportive member of the group. I gave Scott his script. "I enroll you as real father who terrified you. I enroll as your real father who terrified you when you were a little girl," which he repeated. Note that this work is not about improvisation, but about accurately enacting the dialogue and directions provided by the witness and protagonist. I then asked Maria where she would like her real father to be positioned, and she instructed Scott to stand about 12 feet away, slightly to her right and facing away from her. We were beginning to create the tableau, and every time I conduct a structure, I'm impressed by how precise the outward projections of the right hemisphere are. Protagonists already know exactly where the various characters in their structures should be located. It also surprises me again and again how the placeholders representing the significant people in the protagonist's life past, almost immediately assume a virtual reality. The people who enroll them seem to become the people he or she had to deal with back then, not only to the protagonist, but often to the other participants as well. I encouraged Maria to take a good look at her real father, and as she gazed at him standing there, we could witness how her emotions shifted between terror and deep sense of compassion for him. She tearfully reflected on how difficult his life had been, how as a child during World War II, he had seen people beheaded, how he had been forced to eat rotten fish infested with maggots. Structures promoted one of the essential conditions for deep therapeutic change, a trance-like state in which multiple realities can live side by side, present and past. Knowing that you're an adult while feeling the way that you did as a child, expressing your rage or terror to someone who feels like your abuser while being fully aware that you're talking to Scott, who is nothing like your real father, and experiencing simultaneously the complex emotions of loyalty, tenderness, rage, and longing that kids feel for their parents, with their parents. As Maria began to speak about their relationship when she was a little girl, I continued to mirror her expressions. Her father had brutalized her mother, she said. He was relentlessly critical of her diet, her body, her housekeeping, and she was always afraid for her mother when he berated her. Maria described her mother as loving and warm. She could not have survived without her. She would always be there to comfort Maria after her father lashed out at her, but she didn't do anything to protect her children from their father's rage. I think my mom had a lot of fear herself. I have a sense that she didn't protect us because she felt trapped. At this point, I suggested that it was time to call Maria's real mother into the room. Maria scanned the group and smiled brightly as she asked Kristen, a blonde Scandinavian-looking artist, to play the part of her real mother. Kristen accepted the formal words of the structure. I enroll as your real mother, who is warm and loving, and without whom you would not have survived, but who failed to protect you from your abusive father. Maria had her sit on the pillow to her right, much closer than her real father. I encouraged Maria to look at Kristen, and then I asked, so what happens when you look at her? Maria angrily said, nothing. A witness would see how you stiffen as you look at your real mom and angrily say that you feel nothing, I noted. After a long silence, I asked again, so what happens now? Maria looked slightly more collapsed and repeated, nothing. I asked her, is there something you would like to say to your mom? Finally, Maria said, I know you did the best you could. And then moments later, I wanted you to protect me. When she began to cry softly, I asked her, what is happening inside? Holding my chest, my heart feels like it is pounding really hard. Maria said, my sadness goes out to my mom, how incapable she was of standing up to my father and protecting us. She just shuts down, pretending everything's okay, and in her mind, it probably is. And that makes me mad today. I want to say to her, Mom, when I see you react to Dad when he is being mean, when I see your face, you look disgusted, and I don't know why you don't say, fuck off. You don't know how to fight. You are such a pushover. There is a part of you that is not good and not alive. I don't even know what I want you to say. I just want you to be different. Nothing you do is right. Like you accept everything when it is totally not okay. I noted. A witness could see how fierce you are as you want your mother to stand up to your dad. Maria then talked about how she wanted her mother to run off with the kids and take them away from her terrifying father. I then suggested enrolling another group member to represent her ideal mother. Maria scanned the room again and chose Ellen, a therapist and martial artist. Maria placed a pillow on her right between her real mother and herself and asked Ellen to put her arm around her. What do you want your ideal mother to say to your dad? I asked. I wanted her to say, if you are going to talk like that, I'm going to leave you and take the kids. She answered, we're not going to sit here and listen to this shit. Ellen repeated Maria's words. Then I asked, what happens now? Maria responded, I like it. I have a little pressure in my head. My breath is free. I have a subtle, energetic dance in my body now. Sweet. A witness can see how delighted you are when you hear your mother saying that she is not taking the shit from your dad anymore and that she will take you away from him, I told her. Maria began to sob and said, I would have been able to be a safe, happy little girl. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see several group members weeping silently. The possibility of growing up safe and happy clearly resonated with their own longings. After a while, I suggested that it was time to summon Maria's ideal father. I could clearly see the delight in Maria's eyes as she scanned the group, imagining her ideal father. She finally chose Danny. I gave him his script and he gently told her, I enroll as your ideal father, who would have loved you and cared for you and who would not have terrified you. Maria instructed him to take a seat near her on her left and beamed, my healthy mom and dad. She exclaimed. I responded, allow yourself to feel that joy as you look at an ideal dad who would have cared for you. Maria cried, it is beautiful, and threw her arms around Danny, smiling at him through her tears. I am remembering a really tender moment with my dad, and that is what it feels like. I would love to have my mom next to me too. Both ideal parents tenderly responded and cradled her. I left them there for a while so they could fully internalize the experience. We finished with Danny saying, if I had been your ideal dad back then, I would have loved you just like this and not have inflicted my cruelty. While Ellen added, if I had been your ideal mom, I would have stood up for you and me and protected you and not let any harm come to you. All the characters then made final statements, de-enrolling from the roles they had played and formally resumed being themselves. That is incredible. And I don't know, it totally makes me want to like try this on myself. I don't know. I don't know. Like, I guess with the version where Bessel was doing it with Al in his barn and using objects as players, pretty incredible to be able to detach the energy of the actual person and place it on something neutral to act out and be more empowered and create your own healing space and have other people or other items or energy support it. That is beautiful. And I just love these new ways or alternative ways of healing other than being shoved medications or having to sit in a therapy room and just only talk and repeatedly and not really get anywhere after years of therapy. So this totally seems way more supportive and productive in people's healing and shifting the energy. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, that is the end for today. We have 3 more weeks and we are done with this book. So you all, if you enjoyed this week's reading, please remember to like the video, share it. If you have not subscribed, I would love to welcome you to subscribe. Take a look at my Patreon as well. You will get access to bonus content, one-on-one coaching, which is in my top tier, private readings, private group chats, and a weekly newsletter and a weekly energy read. So, and as well. So it's really great down there. Check it out. Also check out my booking if you would like to private reading with me. And yeah, so you all remember you are sovereign, powerful, worthy, and loved. Thank you for being here with me today. See you on the next show. Bye.